Good afternoon, everyone. Again, this is Phil Wells coming to you guys, Facebook Live. Happy to be here. And I'm joined here at NCSA Live by my co-host, Danny Koenig, here as a former college coach. Danny, how you doing?
How are you? Got me? How you doing?
Gotcha.
Feeling good, man. I'm out here in Denver. It's 60 degrees and sunny, which has done wonders for my headspace. But yeah, man, I'm feeling good about things. How are you?
I'm doing well. Can't say it's quite 60 here in Chicago, but I never can be mad at 60 no matter where the location is. Then excited to speak with the people today. We're going to tackle some of the recruiting myths that really serve as huge misconceptions in the recruiting process. First, we're really going to dive into the 4 common college recruiting myths. We're going to debunk them. We're going to talk about, what are the recruiting myths? We're going to talk about really diving into how college coaches will find you from you being proactive. We're going to talk about the misconception of full ride scholarships. We're going to actually dive into really the role that your personal coach will play in your process. And then lastly, we're going to definitely wrap it up with, really the time to start. A lot of families think it's junior year. We're going to debunk that a little bit as well. And really to kick us off, as far as a recruiting myth, right? It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a myth. A lot of times as we go throughout the recruiting journey amongst the process, different misconceptions pop up about when to do what, how college coaches are recruiting, the family's role, that the high school coach's role. We want to tackle a lot of that stuff. And really, we like to start and dive in with, your college coach that you may be targeting, how they can find you. Okay, a lot of the misconceptions that really target families are, number one, if you're good at your sport, a college coach will find you. That is not always the case. And then I know you were actually, you were a coach. You were a coach at the college level, and I'm sure you can very much speak to this personally. What do you feel, or how do you relate in your personal experience about just the aspect of, hey, if I'm good enough, a coach will find me?
Yeah, I think there's certainly an element where as a coach, you have to have some sort of outreach, right? So I used NCSA pretty much every day or at least twice a week. I was running searches for athletes that are going to fit what I am looking for as a program. But I think the biggest fear for me as a former college coach is that you're going to miss that kid that could do really, really well for you, right? So it's almost impossible to search through every athlete in NCSA's network, or guarantee that you're going to find that athlete that really does fit what you're looking for. So to a degree, you really are relying on those athletes that have found your program that might be a good fit to stand up for themselves and say, hey, I'm going to be very good for your program. I think I'm going to be admitted to your school. This is why I think I'm going to be a good fit for your program, and then kind of open up a discussion that way. So even if you're the best athlete on your team, your college recruiting process will probably not look the same of that of a 5-star recruit. And you just have to be honest with yourself about that. So I think the other thing that we have to consider right now, and we've been in the face of a pandemic, which is, I think, has amplified this to a degree, but most coaches have a limited travel budget. They can't afford to visit every single high school and actively recruit beyond their region. It's an impossible task, right? And because everybody's got the internet, it's 2021. And like I'd mentioned before, in the face of a pandemic, probably 95 to 100% of recruiting is going to at least start online, right? So athletes need to be proactive in the college recruiting process to get on a coach's radar. It's just not only recommended, but it is preferred by college coaches or former college coaches like myself. And that was just my experience. So you need to create and continuously update high quality highlight film or skills video if that applies to you. These coaches want to be able to assess your actual ability without being able to come and see you play. Another way that you can do this is to attend camps and clinics where there will be college coaches in attendance. And then beyond that, like I said, Bill, and this is, again, personal experience, what I had seen as a former college coach, create an NCSA recruiting profile. It doesn't cost you any money to be able to do that, to get all of your academic and athletic information, including that highlight tape, in one place to increase your exposure to coaches online. So like you had said, Bill, recruiting has changed quite a bit. And, there are a lot of constraints that are going to keep a coach from being able to travel around and actually see you in person, right? You have to figure out some alternative routes to be found by coaches and open up lines of communication that way.
Absolutely. And just like you mentioned, we're in a time that's a little bit different. So while we historically look at, even camps being one of the main ways that, you can start asserting yourself to college coaches, revolving back to actually that online presence, having an NCSA recruiting profile. That way, while we're still in that transition of camps arising back here in 2021, we can still make sure we have an online profile. So again, college coaches can evaluate, spot check, and really look at you as a prospect at the click of a button, at the search of a browser. Now, as we move on, looking at the next major misconception, the next major myth as we take it in the recruiting process as it pertains scholarships. One of the biggest myths we see is that, hey, I'm going to get a full scholarship. It's common. It's easy. Full ride scholarships, they're not common by any measure. Okay, and a lot of times we see that phrase, we see that wording thrown around, but typically, less than, 10% get that full ride scholarship. In fact, 34 to 35 different NCAA sports out there, only 6 of them have full ride scholarships. Only 6 offer full ride scholarships. Those 6 sports, they include in the Division I category, FBS football, men's and women's basketball, women's tennis, women's volleyball, and women's gymnastics. All other sports, non-full ride. Now, those 6 sports I just detailed, they are labeled as your head count sports. Those are your sports where, again, everything is going to be paid for. But the many other sports outside of that, we label those as your equivalency sports. And those are going to be those sports termed where, you're looking to kind of merit that funding a little bit. Typically, a college coach has a budget, and they split it up accordingly. Now, Danny, I know as a former college coach, that may be a little bit daunting. That could be a potential task that, is not super ideal, not super user-friendly. So when it comes down to, a college coach not at one of those head count schools and you're tasked with a budget and you have to split that up, how do you maybe go about that? Can you maybe just share a little bit of a personal experience about how you view splitting up some of that scholarship money?
Yeah, it's a really, really difficult process. And, I think part of this to blame is, the media, ESPN, really focusing on the Division I type of schools, that, a lot of the conversation is going to surround those big Division I programs, your footballs, your basketballs, right? The money-making sports, where those programs are, in most cases, what we call fully funded. They have the most amount of scholarships that the NCAA is going to allow to them. And they are on those head count scholarship numbers. So you're either on scholarship or you are not, potentially as a walk-on. So, when that's the rhetoric, I think there is this belief, this myth that if you're going to participate in college athletics, that you're going to get a scholarship, and that scholarship is going to be a full ride for 4 years. And that is absolutely uncommon. So, when I was coaching, it was swimming and diving, and that is an equivalency, meaning that they can break these up into percentages. Again, not that you couldn't potentially be on a full ride scholarship for those sports if that coach wanted to give you 100% of a scholarship, but in many cases you're getting 20%, 25%. Maybe you're on a book scholarship, getting a chunk of your tuition paid for, right? And I think that's something that you have to factor into. Hey, is my sport an equivalency sport? What am I to expect in this process when a scholarship offer does come in, and kind of, set yourself up in that direction, thinking that way if scholarship is important to you. The other thing that, I wanted to touch on, because it's not something that's discussed very frequently, is that idea of being fully funded, right? So a lot of the schools that I was coaching at, even at the Division I level, were not fully funded, meaning that there is an upper scholarship limit to for any given sport. Right. So, for instance, women's swimming is 14 full scholarships. Now, they're on average going to carry a roster of about 28 athletes, meaning only about half of those athletes could potentially be on a full ride scholarship. All of those athletes could be on a half scholarship or anything in between, including athletes that might not be on that scholarship. So, that is fully funded. That is not what is available for every single graduating class. That is for the entire team. And that does not guarantee that school or that particular program is fully funded, right? Meaning that they have the full allotted amount of scholarships headed their way. So it can be very, very tricky. And I think coaches keep it very close to their chest, the amount of money that they have available in terms of scholarships to give to student athletes. And I think one big tactic that I use as a coach was to identify and evaluate athletes that had good grades. Good grades and good test scores are in a lot of cases going to earn an athlete a lot more money from the school than they would ever be able to get from an athletic scholarship. And that was part of my game to make up some of that money that they may earn in scholarship from another school, to say, hey, look, we can offer you 2/3 of a tuition credit for 4 years. That is the commitment the school is going to make to you that you would never have to pay back. And then to that, we can add a small portion of a scholarship to potentially be competitive in that regard. So there's a lot of tactics that coaches are going to use to be able to help an athlete earn money to attend their academic institution and play that sport. But we can't get wrapped up in the ESPN, top 100. All of those kids are probably going to end up on a full ride head count day one of their freshman year and have that for 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, and I think it's a continued challenge, but it's just about knowing the difference. Dan, you make a huge point because, of that media being really what we see on TV every day, you can't help but, think that's how the process works. But we have to we have to think outside the box a little bit further. And, we certainly have to make sure we know every aspect of the process in terms of what potential funding you may receive. Just not realistic what you see on TV in those big ESPN showcases. So really, transitioning that next point that we actually see, again, pretty frequently. And again, it makes sense. The main myth, the myth that holds a lot of weight that we actually see here coming up is, that your high school coach, your club coach, they're going to handle recruiting for you. While that sounds ideal, while some do, it's not always the case. And in fact, it's not that high school coach, it's not that club coach's responsibility to get you recruited. Now, again, a lot of coaches are great as far as high school coaches, club coaches, rec coaches. A lot of them are great, and a lot of them will do all that they can to help you in recruiting. And when that happens, take full advantage. But we need to make sure the onus, we need to make sure the family, the student athlete, that's where the ownership needs to take place. That's where the most appropriate aspect needs to really take place. And that's where the most action needs to take place amongst reaching out to coaches and amongst taking steps in recruiting. At this particular time, when we look at, the role of a high school coach, the role of a club coach, it's to win games. Okay, it's to win games. And any help in recruiting, a lot of them are kind-hearted. A lot of them will do what it takes to still help you out. If I'm sharing one of my personal stories, again, we take football, me coming out of high school, had a great coach. And a coach that I had did everything that, was humanely possible to help me in recruiting. But you take my personal example, and this example can serve for a lot of coaches out there at the high school level or club level. Guess what? I was playing a sport of football. I'm not the only athlete on the team. 60 other athletes on the team. And guess what? That coach, he's not just our football coach. He's also our science teacher. He's also the gym teacher. We have a lot of different roles, especially when it comes to that high school, that club coach. And even though the right heart, the right mindset may be there to help you out, recruiting takes a lot. They may not be able to do all of what it takes. Now, with that being said, that coach that's really helping you out, that coach that's your high school coach, your club coach, that is going the extra mile, that is actually doing what it takes to, make sure you're doing the right things in recruiting, that's awesome. And within NCSA, we have space for those coaches. Danny, I know you can talk about this a little bit, because when it comes to those high school coaches who do actually take that extra time, although it may be daunting, with those coaches that do that extra work to maybe help track that progress, as it pertains to that student athlete's, journey in recruiting. Danny, what can that look like here at NCSA?
No, that's a great point. And I think, you nailed it on the head there. Coaches, they want to help you. They want to see you succeed. But quite frankly, recruiting can be a full-time job. And if they're, managing a science class and 60 athletes, there's only so much that they can do, right? They're just one person. But there is a lot of trust there between, families, the student athlete, and their coach. And they want those coaches to help, and a lot of coaches will. So NCSA, a handful of years ago, recognized this need for coaches that wanted to be able to help their athletes. And we actually set up this online portal called Team Edition, where, those coaches can actually upload the athletes that have existing NCSA recruiting profiles or they have the option to start free recruiting profiles for the athletes. Some have them, attach them to this Team Edition account. And that's a portal for these coaches to be able to track not only how those athletes are using it, are they filling out the profile to completion? Are they favoriting schools that, fit their target criteria? Are they sending out emails to coaches proactively? That's one portion of it, but those coaches can also track which college coaches are interacting with that athlete's profile, right? So it's an easier way to actually take some of that work off of the coach's plate, take away that guessing game a little bit about what's actually going on in recruiting, and be able to have a higher level of conversation about real data in real time about how these athletes are recruiting or what they're doing in the recruiting process proactively. So, certainly can make it easier. And again, even if your coach is using NCSA Team Edition, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to do all the recruiting for you. It just allows them to kind of give you a sense for what's going on. You're still going to have to tackle that, right? So, Phil, we talk a lot about this, that, in recruiting, there's basically a set amount of time and a set amount of work, right? That never changes. Whether you start that when you're a junior or when you start that when you're a freshman, that work still has to happen. Team Edition is a way for your coaches to be able to help guide you along in that process. But at the end of the day, just like we had said before, it is the necessity for the family and the athlete to be proactive, to figure out what they want and then go out and get it. Now, if you're a coach out there and you coach a club team, you coach a high school team, you want to set up an NCSA Team Edition account, reach out to me. Right. I'll make sure that you guys have my contact information. We'll throw it here in the side chat, but I want you to reach out to me, say, hey, I'm interested in helping my athletes through the recruiting process. We'll set up a time to actually go through this. I will set you up an account. We'll bring in the athletes that have profiles. If you want to start profiles for the rest of your athletes because they're thinking towards college, you can do that. And I'll make sure that you have the features. That's something I do pretty much every day. So something to consider if you're a coach out there and wondering a little bit more about the recruiting process. You want to learn from a former Division I coach and a recruiting coordinator, just reach out to me. I'd be happy to talk you through that and get you guys set up in that direction as well.
Very good, very good. And I think that's a great call to action for a lot of those high school and club level coaches, again, prior to college, that really do look to, extend that extra lending hand because, again, every effort counts. So definitely make sure, again, as a student athlete, you're really paying attention to those coaches that are helping you out, but also making sure the ownership starts with you. The main action starts with you. And as Danny talked about that time gap, right? That window of, set work that needs to be done in recruiting. It's essential. And again, just like you mentioned, Danny, whether you started as a freshman or a junior, you need to do the same amount of work. And obviously starting earlier is going to be more of a benefit and, versus looking at things as a crunch. And that really brings us to that, to our last myth, right? And really, this is one of the ones that hit home pretty well for a lot of people, and it makes sense. I know this was my interpretation of the recruiting process once I started my journey so many years ago. But the biggest myth, or one of the biggest myths that we kind of went over today here is, hey, the recruiting process, it starts your junior year. Totally a misconception. Now, the one thing that I will address in this really supports why this is such a big misconception. Now, junior year for most sports is the first year where official personalized contact can be allowed. So with that simple fact alone, most families think, hey, that's when personalized contact starts, so that's when a process starts. Wrong. The recruiting process starts as early as 13 years old. At 13 years old, that is when you become an NCAA eligible recruit. What does that mean? That doesn't mean a college coach is going to be calling you right away. They're not allowed to. But that does mean they're able to look and view and evaluate you as a prospect. So as a prospect, legally at the age of 13, that is when you start being proactive in the recruiting process. That is when, as a family, you start taking steps in the recruiting process. And again, maybe that doesn't look like, you calling coaches or you visiting schools, but the thought process has to be there, and we have to know the recruiting is well underway. And as we look at, certain things that we do in junior year, yes, as a college coach, that is that time where, maybe I'm sending out more letters. Maybe I'm sending out handwritten letters. Maybe at a certain point now I'm calling. But as a college coach, when that junior year rolls around, I don't have a big hat of names that coach is just pulling out. That coach doesn't have a hat of names that they're just pulling from. They're calling those individuals that have been proactive since 13 years old. They're calling those individuals that they've actually evaluated, since, 12, 13, 14 years old. In a lot of cases, it can even be before 13 years old if you're really a real standout, or, I can be on you. But overall, 13 and up is really when you want to get started. And then as far as a college coach, a former college coach's opinion goes, I know it's a little bit of a fine line sometimes when we look at how early evaluations start. But why don't you talk a little bit about the benefits as a college coach is concerned of looking at a kid when he's 13 years old, when maybe you can't even make a call until, 2-3 years later?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And I think a fact that bears repeating, you are recruitably aged at 13 years old. You have not even set foot in your high school. And that is an NCAA limitation, right? 13 years old. And NCSA is completely NCAA compliant. So we will not work with someone until they're 13. But once they do turn 13, it's open season. And I can promise you, we have Division I coaches that are asking us for prospects in the 8th grade. I would say some sports are going to be a little bit more accelerated than others. Certain division levels are going to be a little bit more competitive than others. Typically, women's sports are going to be a little bit more accelerated than men's sports because sometimes girls can develop earlier and be much closer to college ready by the time they're freshmen or sophomores. So understanding that there are going to be coaches out there that are identifying and evaluating 13 and 14-year-old, depending on your goals and what you want to get accomplished. If you're thinking D1 scholarship and you are in one of those sports like women's soccer, like softball, you probably have to get started with something and be proactive, maybe a little bit earlier than men's swimming and diving, for instance. So the other thing about this in dealing with thousands of families and kind of helping them through the process, I have never, not once, heard a family say, wow, we started this way too early. It's always the opposite. It's like, man, we didn't know. We didn't know that coaches were looking. We feel a little bit behind at this point. And, I'm not sitting here doom and gloom and saying, hey, if you're a junior and you haven't picked up the phone and talked to a coach, that you're never going to get recruited. That's not necessarily the case. But you have to understand that those coaches have been contacting your grad class for quite some time at this point. And you got to correct. You got to take some corrective action. So I think, when we kind of look at the bigger picture and we talk about being proactive, in many cases, by the time you're the start a sophomore year, just start that recruiting profile, right? Just get your information on paper, start taking film. You don't even have to cut together the highlight tape just yet until maybe halfway through your sophomore year. Again, this is very situational. I'm talking in broad terms here about the recruiting process, but don't get caught behind, right? And I guess my example for this as a former Division I coach and someone who was very involved with recruiting is that I probably spent between 12 and 18 months in advance of the official contact date, which now for swimming and diving is June 15th after your sophomore year. I'm spending at least a year in advance running searches through NCSA. I'm looking at film. I'm keeping track of times. I'm looking at grades, right? I'm starting to build that target list for who I want to proactively say, hey, we're interested in you. Are you interested in us? And then when that date hits, June 15th after your sophomore year, I am calling my top prospects on that day. And that is no exaggeration because I'm as competitive as the next guy. I don't want the team across the conference reaching out to that athlete when I think that they'd be a good fit for my program. Right? I wouldn't be a very good recruiter if I wasn't doing that. So what that means for your recruitment, and when we talk about being proactive, yes, get out ahead of it. Yes, build this in advance because we know coaches are looking. Yes, find those schools that make sense for you. NCSA has this platform to help you find schools. Target lists of schools should be between 30 or 40, at least initially. And then raise your hand and let that coach know, because that line of communication is always open towards the coach. And that is communication that they're looking for in advance of the contact period. Doesn't necessarily mean that they can get back to you at that time, but they want to hear of your interest before the contact period so that they can organize themselves to either reach out by email or get you on the phone and learn more about your interest and potentially get you on campus a few months down the line. So it can be a little bit tricky. I think, like I said, if you're freshman, sophomore, you're right on time. If you're a junior, senior, you're just getting started with this, you're absolutely behind, but there's still a lot of time and methodologies for getting to where you want to be. You just got to understand how to hit the ground running, and that's exactly what we're here to help you guys do.
Absolutely, really good points there, Danny, and I always love just hearing that experience there from a former college coach, and it makes sense. You know, we're doing a lot of the things we do in the recruiting process to make sure we're up to par with, you know, what college coaches expect, what college coaches evaluate, what they're looking for. So always great hearing from you, Danny, in that regard. And, you know, I know at this point the people may have a lot of different questions, so definitely don't forget to submit to Q&A as we, you know, we'll definitely dive into some questions here in a little bit. But overall, make sure everyone, guys, avoid these common misconceptions. You know, avoid thinking that just because you may be the best on your team, coaches are going to find you. It's not going to happen. Avoid thinking about, you know, full scholarships being super, super common. It's not the case. You know, avoid thinking your high school coach or your club coach is going to be the sole provider of everything recruitment. Okay, it's oftentimes proved the complete opposite. And then lastly, as Danny just touched on in really good detail, in order to be successful, in a recruiting journey, in a recruiting process, we have to avoid these misconceptions, and we have to make sure we're getting a head start in recruiting, not waiting the junior year, but it's starting as soon as possible. And as far as the thought process goes, again, 13 years old is when it gets started. But something I like to tell families all the time: hey, the moment you know that college is a goal to play at the next level, no matter how old you are, start thinking about it. No matter how old you are, start thinking about it. And with that, you know, make sure you're avoiding some of that stuff, guys. We'll go ahead and dive into some questions.
Well, the only thing I'm going to bring up here is, like, I think there's a negative view of college athletic recruiting services. That is what NCSA is, right? That's ridiculous. As a college coach, I used a college recruiting service to help me build championship rosters and turn out All-Americans. All right. You know, this whole idea, we need to demystify at least that, because really NCSA was built from the ground up with the athlete in mind to help you connect with college coaches. And quite frankly, we've earned the trust of the NCAA, the NAIA, the National Junior College Athletic Association, and every single college coach in the country has free, unrestricted access to this. Right. So look, it's, you know, you got to put that aside. I know your coaches want to help. We got something set up for them. And this is really going to fall on your shoulders, and you don't have anyone else to blame at the end of this process, because NCSA exists. It's here to help you guys. So again, one more thing we're going to demystify about college recruiting services. Man, we exist to help you, and we exist to help coaches. So you got to utilize the resources that are out there. But all right, let's dive into some questions here.
All right, how do you get seen in a small town? Awesome question there coming in from Rachel. And again, we get that a lot. You know, it's a lot of small towns there in the country, right? But I guess, Rachel, just to tackle it hands-on, this is where in a small town you have to be most proactive, okay? And if you're in a bigger town, you have to be proactive in the recruiting process. So if you're in a smaller town, that's when truly at 13 years old, you want to be getting after it, okay? If you're past that point, then this is in particular, you know, being in a small town, this is that point where you have to start emailing coaches. You have to start reaching out. You have to make sure you're getting in that presence of coaches. And, you know, just because you're in a small town doesn't mean you can't have a huge online presence. Just because you're in a small town doesn't mean college coaches shouldn't be able to find video on your athlete, you know, at the click of a button. So the biggest point there, being in a small town, make sure you're more proactive. Make sure you're reaching out to coaches and have an online presence. It's going to be the biggest thing for you.
Yeah. It's a really good one. And I don't think I could have said it much better than that you can be equally as competitive as anybody in a big city, knowing that almost all of recruiting is going to start online. It's just going to be a little bit a-traditional because you're more remote. But I think everybody's remote, and we have been for about the last year. So it's all good. All right, next question. This one from Lee. How do you know if a camp is serious about players or just looking for money received from camp as a fundraiser? This is a really good one, and something important that I think we need to touch on, that, you know, you don't want to just go to a camp and pay $500 for a free t-shirt, right? I think there are a lot of benefits to going to a camp, and I encourage you to go to camps, but you have to understand why you're going to that camp. So if you're going to that camp with the intention of learning from a high level, i.e. college coaches and their athletes, that's great. That has a lot of value, right? If you're going to camp to be seen by college coaches, don't just show up there thinking that that coach is thinking about recruiting you, right? And I think the big distinction is about how you approach those camps and what you're doing leading into those camps if you're leaning on those for exposure and to being recruited. So, Phil, I'd love for you to weigh on this here in a second, but ultimately for me, camps, target, if you're using those to get recruited, target the camps at schools or target coaches that are going to be at certain camps and let them know ahead of time. Coach, I'm interested in your program. I know you're running a camp this summer. I'd love to be a part of that so you can, or so I can meet you in person. If that coach is going to be at a different camp, right, but you still want to get in front of that coach in particular, understand that you are going to that camp to get in front of that college coach, but don't get there, without at least notifying the coach that you're interested first. You got to let the coach know that you're going to be there, what your name is, your highlight tape, your grades, that you're interested in their program, and then say, hey, I'm going to be there. I'd love to chat with you when I'm there about the program, those sorts of things. So, Phil, what are your thoughts on kind of distinguishing camps one from another and what the purpose of those camps or clinics might be?
Yeah, so I think you hit on a lot of great points, Danny. And first, I like to just re-represent how you open things up. A lot of those camps, depending on what that price point may be, we call them $500 T-shirts. We call them $500 water bottles. We got to just make sure we're getting something after it or something out of it. And again, we can always get something out of a camp, no matter how it's termed, whether it's a traditional camp, whether it's a combine, whether it's termed a showcase. As long as, a coach is there, or as long as there's work being done, we can get something out of it. But the best rule of thumb there amongst getting your best out of it is making sure, again, you can reach out to that coach ahead of time, making sure some coach that's going to be there, and making sure they know you to some extent before you show up. Okay, this should be just about passing the eyeball test. It shouldn't be a brand new introduction. And I'll share a quick story there in my personal experience. Again, as I have a football background, it was Grand Valley State as I was in my junior year of high school. And by this time period, I had been communicating with Grand Valley State out in Michigan for, the last couple of years. They had looked at a little bit of my film. I had been proactively sending it off to them. And for the most part, they knew what I was capable of as a student athlete, both on the field and off. Okay, both in the classroom and out. So they had a good idea of who I was, and now it was just time to pass that eyeball test. But guess what? Took a road trip down to Michigan, down from Chicago. The whole entire road trip, I had a fever. Slept the whole way, just thinking I was going to kick it 6 to 7 hours. Finally got there. The fever didn't go nowhere. I toughed it out the best I could, showed up, and performed terribly. If I wasn't the worst athlete there, just on that particular day. But guess what? My only saving grace was those coaches, they saw my film ahead of time. Those coaches, they knew my character ahead of time. They knew my grades ahead of time. They knew a little bit of what I was capable of ahead of time. And they understood that, hey, this may just be a bad day. But guess what? If we actually go to a camp blindly without doing a little bit of homework ahead of time, without reaching out to a coach, and maybe we have a bad day, it happens to the best of us. If that happens, what do you want? That first impression? Or do you want that coach to say, hey, maybe this kid has had a bad day because we've seen better? So definitely keep that in mind when we're looking at those camps, because that's going to be the biggest component, just making sure we're getting our best out of it.
Phil, I have a hard time picturing you being the worst athlete on any field at any time, but that's just me. So, but that's a great example. Perfect example that, if you hadn't done your homework ahead of time and you just show up there, they just think this is another scrub who's trying to earn a scholarship. But, those coaches knew that wasn't the case. And that can happen. Right, you can't put all your eggs in that basket and say, hey, I'm going to knock it out of that park and that coach is going to offer me on the spot, because realistically, that's just not how the process goes down. And you could potentially have a bad day, right? There's just no telling. But I appreciate that story. I do want to get to one more question before we do our shout outs. This one's from Bob Kristen Rucka. How often should my daughter contact the schools in which she is interested? Every showcase, every month? I think a big part of this has to do with your graduating class, and if you're in the contact period for the most part, which schools you're contacting, the level that they're at, and where those coaches might be in the recruiting cycle. So if you're a junior, I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to contact a coach every month or updating them when you go to a camp, clinic, showcase, right? If you have new statistics, new video, that is an open contact period for literally every college coach in the country. And that's what they're looking for. They want to make sure that you're making progress, that you continue to be someone that they want to recruit. Grades are also going to be a big part of that. So every single semester, maybe not every quarter, but when you get official grades of the trimester or the semester, send that to the coach proactively. Say, coach, got unofficial transcripts here. Here's a screenshot. Let me know if you need anything, right? Taking my SAT, ACT scores this April, right? For the first time, I'll update you as soon as those things go on. So there is a lot to talk about in your junior year, and that is something that coaches are looking for. Now, if you're in maybe a later recruiting cycle at a lower division level as a freshman or a sophomore, maybe you're starting to reach out to some NAIA programs or Division III programs as a sophomore, they might not be looking for that kind of communication once a month. Once every 2-3 months, just a quick update. Hey, coach, still thinking about your program. I did some research on the business school. I'm looking forward to visiting campus one day. Always ask the coach for something. Hey, do you have an idea of, when you're going to start inviting my class to campus? Would love to meet the team. Would love to see, the athletic facilities, whatever it might be. So again, largely dependent. I'm sorry, I can't really give you a straight answer on that. But I say generally, if you're an underclassman, maybe in a later recruited sport, and later recruited division level, maybe once every couple of months, just let that coach know that you're still thinking about him and still interested in the program. If you're in an open contact period with Division II, Division I schools, and coaches are having conversations once a week with their top prospects, be competitive that way, right? Reach out to the coach, let them know that you're really interested, so that your name doesn't kind of fall down the list or so. But Phil, anything that you would add to that or do differently?
No, I think you hit on a really good point there. Just upon a differentiation between, underclassmen, upperclassmen. Again, just to summarize it, underclassmen, be a little bit more conscious, as college coaches probably aren't looking to hear from me that much because, again, their responses are going to be limited. So again, on a 3-month rotation, roughly, is a good rule of thumb. And then again, junior year and up is go time. It's go time. And we definitely want to make sure we have it a little bit more frequent, and every month sounds right on tact about updating coaches and making sure that you can really get a genuine answer from them about their interest level. So absolutely. Great points, Danny.
All right, cool. Let's wrap this thing up with some college commitments, right? So this is something that we like to do, is just honor those that have navigated this process, that have tuned in every week to NCSA Live to learn more about this, and ultimately committed to their school. They've spent a lot of time being able to do this, and that's something that we want to celebrate. So first and foremost, tennis player Kylie Meisdorp. She's going to Eckerd College next year. Love that photo. The action photos always get me, Phil. I don't know about you, but I just think it's a really good look and something that coaches want to see. So congratulations to Kylie.
Yeah, and special real quick to Kylie, actually coming over from South Africa over to Eckerd. So huge shout out to her. With again, definitely a cool action
Shout
shot.
out the international recruit. Love it. That's good. All right, Phil, you got the next one.
Absolutely. We got Matthew Saylor there with a huge goal, it looks like he scored there. Ton of excitement getting the team pumped up. This is actually Chris Saylor's son, for those of you guys in the football world and maybe in a kicking atmosphere. But Matthew Saylor, great job in terms of committing to Pacific University out in Oregon. Again, really pumped up for him. I'm sure I can't be as excited as he is in this picture, but again, huge shout out to Matt.
Yeah, and those of you who don't know, Chris Saylor runs kicking and punting camps, and he's actually that's one of our partners to help athletes better themselves, but also get in front of college coaches. So just wanted to give a quick shout out there to Chris Saylor. Last but not least here, Ryan Shaw. He's going to Misericordia University. Again, love the action shots here. Obviously a football player there. Wish all three of those athletes the best of luck next year. They've weathered the storm. Was not easy, but ultimately we had more than 26,000 commitments from the 2020 class, which is more than we've ever had, despite being hit by a global pandemic and obviously changing the course of recruitment. But they kept their ear to the ground. We were able to help them out. They were able to help themselves out, keep things moving forward, and committed to that school. So good for those guys. Phil, always good to see you here, man. It's good to talk. I know we covered a lot of good stuff here today. As a reminder, again, coaches out there or even athletes that have coaches that want them to help, right? If you want your coach to help or you're a coach out there, reach out to me. I'll throw my contact information in there. We can get you guys set up with an NCSA Team Edition account so that you can gain insight into how your athletes are being recruited by college coaches. So look forward to meeting you guys in that respect as well. All right, y'all. Thanks for being here. We'll see you again next Tuesday, 2 p.m. Central. Till then, have a good week. We'll talk soon.